All right. Good morning, afternoon, folks. Thank you for joining us. We still have folks trickling in. I know it's lunchtime for many folks, so we'll probably continue to see people join, but we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of really wonderful content by our three fabulous speakers slash moderators today. So for those of you who I don't know, my name is Erin Olszewski, and I'm a program director with Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders, better known by our wonderful acronym SAFSF. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based on Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho lands, also known as Boulder, Colorado. I would encourage everyone to introduce yourself in the chat today, not only so that your fellow funders can see who's here, but also so that Jay, Cameron, and Jen can see who's part of the conversation and can engage with you all. As you introduce yourself, I, just like myself, would encourage you to share your preferred pronouns as well as the native land that you are occupying and joining us from today. We recognize that land acknowledgement is not the complete picture, but it is a solid start. And so for those of you who maybe don't know what native land you're occupying, I would recommend a really wonderful interactive map and resource that's native-land.ca, sometimes hard to say URLs out loud. I'll plug that into the chat and would definitely recommend taking a look at that and exploring the native land that you're on. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful moderator and very long-time board member, Jen Zuckerman with Duke University's World Food Policy Center. So I will turn it over to you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Erin. I'm so happy to be here and to be here with so many different friends and family. So I'll go ahead and get us started for today. So my colleagues, Dr. Jay Pearson and Cameron Smith, and I are all coming to you from Durham, North Carolina. And Durham is the land of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. And the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation is one of 8 nations that shares geography with North Carolina. And so as we go through the presentation today, first, Dr. Jay Pearson will present, and then Cameron and I will kind of co-present together the second part. Then we're going to open it up to some question and answer. We'll be doing the Q&A from the chat. So please, as we're going through, if you have thoughts, ideas, I'll kind of be paying attention to the chat, and Erin and folks will be helping me out from the SAFSF perspective to make sure that we're kind of catching things. But let me go ahead and get us rolling. So Dr. Jay Pearson is my friend and colleague. He works with me at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University, where he's an associate professor. And his work focuses on the historical role of public policy decision-making in structurally rooted social inequality. And Dr. Pearson also has the dubious honor of having to have an office next to me. So his work is constantly interrupted by my loud talking, which, you know, it's just part of the package. And so let me also introduce Cameron Smith, who will be presenting with me in the second part of our conversation today. So Cameron's the co-founder and executive director of Communities in Partnership, which is a community-rooted organization here in Durham, North Carolina. She's also an Aspen Institute Fellow, an RWJF Culture of Health leader, a member of the Equitable Food-Oriented Development National Executive Steering Committee, and she's also a brilliant, badass woman who gets things done. So excited for everyone to be able to share space with my great friends and colleagues. And Dr. Pearson, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jen. I am Jay Pearson. I prefer that you not refer to me as doctor if you have questions for me later. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I bring greetings to you from Duke University, which sits on the historical lands of, as Jen said, both the Occaneechi, Saponi, and the Shipori people, native people. So I'm here in North Carolina. So start by sharing the screen. Can you all actually see the screen? Yes. Thumbs up. Nod. Yeah. And so my task today, if I understand it, is that I will discuss population level health disadvantage in the United States of America and two manifestations in particular. The first is differences in socioeconomic indicators, or what most folks refer to as class. Then I'll talk some about racialized health inequity or racialized health disadvantage. I will give you all compelling empirical examples of what happens when these two phenomena intersect and are viewed in not entirely critically or particularly insightful ways. I will then define structural inequality, give an illustrative example of structural inequality, structural racism, and explain how structural racism is the foundation upon which systemic racism is built. Give some history of the development of the race construct, stratified racial hierarchies, and racial bias in the United States of America. And then share a conceptual framework with you that explains how these three phenomena actually manifest as persistent, long-standing, reliably patterned differences in social well-being and health by racial category, again, in the US context. So on the very first slide here, socioeconomic differences in health, whereby one or some combination of education, occupation, and income measured at either the individual, household, or community level is considered a direct and robust predictor of health. And so we see large improvements in health from low to median levels of those socioeconomic indicators. A diminished but still detectable gradient in health in terms of health improvements from median to high levels of those socioeconomic indicators. And then a flattening of the curve from high to extremely high measures of those socioeconomic indicators. And what this means is that the difference between about $24,000 a year family household income and $36,000 to $38,000 a year so family household income is the impact of that on health is much greater than differences, let's say, between about $125,000 a year up to multiple millions of dollars of income per year, right? So all of the action is at the low end of the socioeconomic distribution. The second phenomenon is longstanding differences in social well-being and health outcomes between ethnic white Americans and Black and Indigenous, as well as other populations of color, again, here in the United States of America. On the slide, I have select Latino groups and select Asian groups because there's incredibly rich heterogeneity contained within those racial categories, ethnic and national origin heterogeneity. And when we collapse or assume that all folks within these categories are having the same social experiences and that those experiences translate into differences in health the same, we miss some really important lessons, and I'll highlight some of those for you all over the course of the next 22 minutes or so. A number of different explanations and different terms used to describe these racialized differences. I'm sure you all have seen the language of racialized disparities, and racial disparities simply documents, or early in this research, simply documented that these differences existed and left open to interpretation to what these differences should be or could be attributed. And folks used notions or advanced notions that there were underlying genetic factors systematically associated with socialized racial categorization, or that there were differences in inherent and independently constructed social cultural values and orientations that were driving these. Certainly there was a period of time where folks looked at differences in dietary practices and physical activity and said it was about individual behavior. Much later, folks looked at differences in health insurance coverage rates and medical care provision and argued that these were responsible for racialized differences in health outcomes. And in subsequent work, those of us in population health studies have demonstrated in no uncertain terms that after accounting for all of these differences, right, in these proposed explanations, and for the record, there is no genetic basis for socially constructed race, and so that couldn't possibly be the explanation. These differences persisted. The second explanation or school of thought related to this uses the language of racialized health inequality and argues that because some populations of color, particularly Black Americans and many Native peoples in the US context, are disproportionately located at the low end of socioeconomic distributions, are much more likely to be lower social class. And we know, or we assume, that class is a direct and robust predictor, again, of health, that those differences in socioeconomic indicators were driving racialized differences. Again, in subsequent work where we've had pretty good data that allows us to control for and account for those differences, the racialized differences persist, right? Then we come to our final term used to describe racialized health disadvantage in the US, which is racialized health inequity, which argues that racialized health differences are a function of factors that in the US context are preventable and avoidable, and consequently unnecessary, but additionally unjust and unfair. And so, a second definition here is we're talking about differences in population health status by racial category, right? So health and death rates that are systemic, reliably patterned, unfair, unjust, and actionable, which means that we can do something about this. We have some ideas of what needs to be done about it, but we lack the social political will and general understanding and appreciation for the value of dignified human interactions to get this stuff done. But please make no mistakes about it. We have pretty good ideas of the kinds of programs that should be brought to bear to try to make this stuff right. It's just not happening. So in terms of racialized health disadvantage here in the United States of America, in the past 30 years or so, since about the early 90s, when eliminating or reducing these differences became a national priority for the NIH and CDC and other federal agencies, state level agencies, researchers interested in this work, there's actually been a net increase in differences from the two leading causes of death, that is congestive heart disease and cancer, right? The Black-white difference has actually grown larger. There are a number of studies that demonstrate differences in medical care provision, whereby both Black and Latino men who have traumatic injuries are less likely to get aggressive pain treatment in emergency room settings when compared to white American men. And another example, and the one that sort of really solidified for me the value of doing this work, were the number of studies that looked at that same propensity to not provide pain medication to Black, Latino, and Native children in emergency room settings who had the same kinds of traumatic injuries as white American children in those settings, right? So this stuff leaks down even to the kids. Of course, we've seen these patterns reliably play out for a number of indicators associated with COVID-19, including infection rates, hospitalizations, death rates. The story on vaccination rates is slightly more complicated, and perhaps y'all will ask questions and we can talk about those complications later. Won't get into that right now. And the illustrative example that we'll use for today's presentation has to do with birth outcomes, right? So we're going to look at a number of studies that examine birth outcomes. But before that, let's take a quick look at use of class or conventionally measured socioeconomic status in the US as it pertains to racialized health disadvantage. And in work that I did 15 years ago now, looking at old documents, as it turns out, this construct socioeconomic status, again, this thing that uses one or some combination of education, occupation, or income, was developed using research that investigated white men in the US and Northwestern European countries only, right? And so we have this construct, SES, or social class, that was developed exclusively with a narrowly defined demographic that has been applied liberally and widely across other demographic groups, right? And one result of this is that there's a lack of sophisticated theories that look at the relationship between race, ethnicity, and health outside of what I mentioned to you earlier, the actual formal class, individual behaviors, health insurance coverage, or direct health services provision. And the result of this is that more contemporary research demonstrates or has taught us that the magnitude and even the direction of the relationship between traditionally measured class, traditionally measured socioeconomic status, and health changes or varies in ways across race, ethnicity that are considered unanticipated, surprising, some would argue even paradoxical, and those terms have been used quite liberally, or certainly were early on when this research began to emerge over the course of the past 25 years or so. Our very first examples address this well-known immigrant health phenomenon, whereby all immigrants to the United States of America across racial and ethnic categories have health indicators, both morbidity, illness, and mortality death rates superior to the total US population. And again, that's all immigrants, all US populations, but when you stratify by racial category, that advantage still holds up within racial categories. That is, folks who are born outside of the US who immigrate who are white do better than white Americans. Folks who are born outside of the US who are racially classified as Black here do better than Black Americans. Similarly with Latino populations and with Asian populations here in the States. A second example has to do with what's referred to as the Latino health paradox, which is Latino immigrants arriving to the United States of America, particularly those who come from Mexico, have health indicators superior to those of all populations in the US. This despite having really low measures of those conventional socioeconomic indicators. That is, very little formal education, really crappy jobs, and low incomes in the US system. The second part of this Latino health phenomenon is that as recently arrived immigrants over time get more advanced formal education and more prestigious, better paying jobs in the US system, their health is getting progressively worse. This is both intragenerationally for that first generation of folks who arrive here over time, and intergenerationally for the kids and grandkids of those first generation immigrants to the US. Oops. Okay. An example of this is research that Arlene Geronimus and I worked on in Detroit, where we use telomere length, which is a measure of accelerated biological aging as an outcome. And what we found is that in and around the city of Detroit, white folks who were poor had bad health, as demonstrated by really short telomeres. And later, if you have questions about what telomeres are, feel free to ask. But white folks in Detroit who were poor had bad health. White folks in Detroit who were not poor had good health. Black folks in Detroit who were poor had better health than poor white folks. But going from poor to being not poor for Black folks in Detroit did not improve their health. And the Mexican origin population in Detroit that was poor had good health. And those who were of Mexican origin in Detroit who were non-poor had bad health, right? And so this narrative of the value of conventional socioeconomic indicators worked for white folks the way that you would expect, did nothing for Black folks, but poor Blacks did better than poor whites, went in the direction opposite of what the dominant narrative would have predicted for the Mexican origin population. And poor Mexicans actually did better than poor Blacks and poor whites, again, in the city of Detroit. Now the maternal and birth outcome examples that I promised that I would share with you all. And another study that I worked on with a group out in California using state level data. Key findings were that white Americans and Black Americans who lived in low SCS community settings had high preterm birth rates, but white Americans who lived in high SCS community settings actually saw significantly improved birth outcomes. That didn't happen for Black Americans, right? And so going from a low SCS community setting to a high SCS community setting did not improve birth outcomes for Black American mothers, the same or even similarly as it did for white American mothers. And in another investigation of birth outcomes, this time the authors are using infant mortality rates, which is the number of deaths per 1,000 live births within the first year of life. Maternal education is our predictor of interest, and we stratify by racial category, white Americans and Black Americans. And we see in this panel that maternal education, for those who have not graduated high school, the infant mortality rate for white American mothers is 9.9, for Black American mothers is 17.3, and the Black to white disadvantage ratio is 1.74. Those who have high school diplomas, for white American mothers, the infant mortality rate drops to 6.5. For Black American mothers, it drops to 14.8. The ratio now is 2.28. For white American mothers who have some college education, the infant mortality rate drops to 5.1. For Black American mothers with some college education, it drops to 12.3. The ratio is now 2.41. And for those with at least an undergraduate degree, 16 years, 4 years of college and beyond, the infant mortality rate for white Americans is 4.2, and for Black Americans, it's 11.4. Two critically important points I'd like to make here. The first is, as we move across these educational gradients, the Black-white ratio is actually increasing, which means that whatever advantages are conferred as a function of more advanced formal education are being conferred at a decreased rate for Black American mothers when compared to white American mothers. The second point is that Black American mothers with at least an undergraduate education do not have infant mortality rates that are lower than white American mothers who have not finished high school, right? Two critically important points. And in this final panel, Gould and colleagues, using data, again, from California on a multi-ethnic sample of mothers, constructed risk profiles, including those conventionally measured socioeconomic indicators, so highest level of formal education, household income, and community level income, and also trimester of engagement with prenatal care as predictors. And 4 types of mothers in this investigation: US born white American mothers, US born Black American mothers, non-US born Mexican immigrant mothers, and non-US born South Asian Indian immigrant mothers. And what the authors found is that white American mothers had a favorable risk profile, and as you would anticipate or expect, positive birth outcomes, while Black American mothers had an unfavorable risk profile, and as you might expect, unfavorable outcomes, while South Asian Indian immigrant mothers had a risk profile that was actually superior to that of the white American mothers, but birth outcomes that were roughly the equivalent of Black American mothers, while the Mexican immigrant mothers had a risk profile that was slightly inferior to that of the Black American mothers, particularly on the formal education and income, but birth outcomes that were actually superior to those of the white American mothers, right? And so factors that place Black American mothers at increased risk for negative birth outcomes did not do the same for Mexican immigrant mothers, and factors that improve birth outcomes for US white mothers did not similarly improve birth outcomes for the Indian immigrant mothers, right? So this is usually the point where I stop and ask the participants to explain this to me and help me understand what the heck is going on in this wonderful social experiment we call the United States of America. In the interest of time, we shall forego that, but I'd be curious when we get to the discussion to hear what some of the feedback is, but I guess I'm about to share that with you, so you should be able to get this right. So a critically important point to take into consideration, as pertains to these phenomenon is this construct of structurally rooted systemic inequality. And what we argue is that structurally rooted systemic inequality entails any sets of social arrangements, conditions, experiences, and other mechanisms to establish and maintain dominating relationships of unequal status that are systemically advantageous to majority population groups while being simultaneously and systemically disadvantageous to minoritized population groups. This means that minority advantage comes at the cost of minority disadvantage in ways that differentially increase or constrain capacity for human development. For the majoritized group, opportunities for human development are increased. For the minoritized groups, those opportunities are constrained and reduced, right? So what we're addressing here are the ways that notions of human difference influence how societies get constructed, right? And the systemic nature of this argues that this phenomenon operates across multiple dimensions of society and imposes its influence at multiple levels within those dimensions. That is, it effectively pervades and suffuses virtually every domain comprising broader US society, right? Think men believing that women were inherently intellectually inferior and consequently not worthy of voting, not worthy of gaining access to formal education, and being effectively disqualified from labor markets. Women gained the right to vote in the United States of America in 1920, right? A little more than 100 years ago. So again, notions of human difference, ideas about inherent value, devalue associated with different population groups, informs normative values, sets of beliefs, behaviors, practices, right? And what this means is after these processes become normative, that this is the regular social functioning. There's nothing aberrant or bad or even mean-spirited about this stuff once it gets set into motion, right? It pervades institutions, again, multiple institutions, and it's just the regular practice as these institutions go about their business of functioning the way that they were set up to function, right? The illustrative example for today, structural racism, sets of social arrangements, conditions, and experiences that are systemically beneficial to white Americans while being systemically and simultaneously detrimental to minoritized populations of color. Again, this means that majority white advantage comes at the cost of minoritized disadvantage being imposed upon populations of color. And structural racism holds that macro level, that is big picture, social processes, including policy decision-making associated with racial construction, racial hierarchy, as well as racial bias, are central organizing features of the nation that were established before its founding, that remain salient to the US social order until the present, and that these are multifaceted, interconnected, and co-occurring phenomenon, and that these are also dynamic and responsive ones. Once again, once this stuff gets established and it gets set in place, it operates independent of there being individual bad actors who are committed to keeping this stuff going, right? And because this stuff was set up before the country was formally founded, structural racism is inextricably linked to US national identity. This is who we are, it's who we've been, and quite frankly, unless we see some major changes in big picture policy decision-making in the United States of America, is who we will continue to be for the foreseeable future, right? This phenomenon impacts the lived experiences and life chances of populations of color in the United States of America to the benefit of white Americans far beyond interpersonal racial discrimination, which survey data teaches us is what most people think of when they hear the language of racism in the US. Race is a social construct that has political, economic, and biological implications. It was conceived of, developed, imposed, and is maintained until today by European colonizers to the emerging nation. The race construct dehumanized the social other for two purposes. It was conceived of to justify material exploitation of Native peoples in the form of appropriation of their historical lands, and economic exploitation of African immigrants in the form of the institution of chattel slavery, right? So indeed, race is about stolen land, labor, humanity, lives, history, heritage, and culture. But perhaps most importantly, race is also about stolen narratives. Who has historically had the opportunity to tell stories of what race is and how it operates matters for our ability to interpret the full range of findings associated with the studies that I shared with you earlier. Race argued that there were underlying differences inherently associated with sets of desirable characteristics and undesirable characteristics, and that these were systematically associated with one or some combination of what people look like, phenotype, where they came from, geographic origin, or who their forefathers and foremothers could be documented to have been. And so what the Northwestern European colonizers argued was that they disproportionately displayed, and this was inherent, the desirable characteristics, while the minoritized populations of color disproportionately displayed, again, this is argued, inherent undesirable characteristics, right? So consequently, they were worthy of being at the pinnacle of this stratified racial hierarchy, while all populations of color and some populations that are now considered white that were diverse on the dimensions of national origin, religion, and ethnicity were relegated to inferior populations also, right? And belief in and values associated with these notions of a natural system became normalized over time. And it is these normalized views and beliefs that inform the institutions and the rules and regulations that govern those through policy decision-making. And that policy decision-making, the institutionalization of those norms, right, established and maintains a rigid stratified hierarchy that uses one or some combination of what people look like, where they came from, or who their ancestors were as social markers for differential placement and positions in that stratified hierarchy and subsequent differential treatment. That differential treatment is called racial bias. And absolutely essential to know about racial bias, that it is first positive supremacy, this notion that one group considered itself inherently superior such that it got to, in an exclusive way, construct the major institutions and rules and regulations that govern those institutions completely independent of any contributions for minoritized folks. Privilege, the sets of advantages that are conferred as a function of belonging to the preferred category of people in such a system. And then there's negative bias, which is oppression, the set of mechanisms that reliably relegate populations of color to inferior positions, and then discrimination, the set of unincurred dispositions or disadvantages that are imposed upon populations of color. And so domination is the dialogue between these processes whereby different racialized actors learn the expected roles that they play in relationship with others. I am from rural Northeastern North Carolina, and I grew up in a context where there was a certain amount of social deference that was required by Blacks, particularly young Black men, when engaging white Americans, particularly white American women. Think Emmett Till and what happened to him way down south, way back when. And so structural racism, then again, this dialogue between supremacy and privilege, oppression and discrimination as domination, has implications for access to resources and exposure to risk, but it also has implications for the way that institutions get engaged as individuals move towards gaining access to resources or being exposed to risk. That is, we cannot assume that the resources cost the same for all groups. That is, that some groups encounter more discrimination in the major institutions than others. We should not also assume that risk exposure results in negative outcomes the same for all population groups. Think differences in sentencing for use of powder cocaine versus crack cocaine in the United States of America and the racialized implications of that. And so what we're talking about is a set of historical processes in structural racism that have contemporary impacts, norms and values that inform policy decision-making associated with the race construct in the first place, racial bias, and how these play out as stratified hierarchies of differential racial valuation. And these operate across multiple dimensions of society, impose their effects at multiple levels of influence within those. And so big picture policy decision-making influencing the establishment of institutions that are fundamentally biased, advantageous to majoritized population whites, disadvantageous to minoritized populations of color. And this is the context within which interpersonal racism occurs. So big picture, policy decision-making, institutions, dynamic processes, all interacting with each other. And in terms of the policy decision-making, 91% of the Native experience in the United States of America has been under explicit policy-sponsored oppression. For Blacks, 86%. For Asians, roughly 67%. And for the Latino population, roughly 87%. Differential immigration, westward land expansion, New Deal policy, all disproportionately benefiting whites, discriminated against populations of color, differences in interest rates on loans in the banking and finance industry, the GI Bill, which effectively moved masses of working class and below white American men into the middle class through free college education, essentially free college education, and really low interest home ownership, discriminated against Black, Latino, and Native war veterans returning from World War II, and legacy university admissions. Here at Duke University, for instance, there were limits on the number of Jewish students that could be admitted in any given class, and Black Americans and Natives were not admitted until 1965. So what's going on? Historical context, contemporary impact, race, ethnicity, conventional resources, alternative resources, and I'll explain to you what I mean there, social cultural orientations, and sets of confirming or disconfirming social experiences, which drive differences in stress, which increase or decrease susceptibility to disease. So majority population whites, through this institutionalized supremacy, constructed a society where privilege grants them relatively unfettered access to primary resources of opportunity that reliably translates into positive health status, the way that the dominant narrative suggests. These majority population whites also constructed systemic oppression, and the race construct was conceived of within this context of oppression and discrimination, institutionalized discrimination, that racially minoritized populations have to engage and negotiate to gain access to these primary resources of opportunity. This discrimination comes at a cost. And ethnicity, different from race. Race is how white folks saw people of color. Ethnicity is how the populations of color view themselves. US ethnicity is constructed within the context of externally constructed and imposed race. And racialized populations in the US bring to bear sets of alternative social cultural orientations to help them more effectively negotiate discriminatory institutions. Whereas those populations of color who are born and raised outside of the US construct ethnicity not contending with imposed race. And part of the reason that we see advantages in health for minoritized populations of color who immigrate to the States is that they haven't contended with this thing yet. But if they stay here long enough, we will teach them and show them exactly where we believe they belong in our racialized hierarchy. And finally, in the event that discrimination costs too much, or the returns that can be expected upon application of the resources that are gained after engaging discriminatory institutions too little, some racial and ethnic minority populations aspire to secure their health circumventing this stuff. And again, we get to question and answer, and we can talk about this. And so I will end by saying robust, justice-informed, anti-racist equity efforts address the structurally rooted systemic nature of racism while acknowledging and proposing to offset both positive and negative racial bias. And my time with you all today has come to an end, and I will pass this off to Jen and Cameron, who will share with you how to go about doing this simple task. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pearson. And I'm gonna take a second to just share my screen, but that's not what I'm gonna do. So hold on one second. So as I'm doing that, I'm gonna I always like to give the bottom line up front. And so the bottom line up front for all of us here in philanthropy is broad scale. What we're doing is not working. Dr. Pearson's data shows that what we're doing is not working for the lives of human beings. So those of us who are in power positions have to. It is our responsibility to disrupt this cycle. So how are we going to do that? We're going to do that through social justice solutions. So I want to just kind of reflect back first to all of us, our statement. So this is our statement from SAFSF that we put forth on June 3rd, 2020, after the murder of George Floyd. So I want to just emphasize what we have acknowledged collectively and how we have acknowledged that our country continues to be built on inequities and systemic racism. And what that does is that it allows deaths to happen and continue to happen again and again. And the same for our food system. So the space in which we're all working causes disproportionate, devastating, and deadly consequences for Black and Brown people. And back to what I was saying previously about our responsibility is that we have both this privilege, and this privilege creates that responsibility to be the advocate for change. And it can't be just about words. So we have to be specific and explicit about our actions. just one of the things that I'll point out, this third bullet, so this is also from our statement. The third bullet, Dr. Pearson talked so much about structural racism. And he noted that when we think racism, most of the time, white folks spend a lot of time defending ourselves as not racist. We're not, fill in the blank. I'm not a good, bad person, and spend a lot of time and energy maintaining our goodness. But we are all collectively swimming in this history and current livelihood of structural racism. So just acknowledging that and saying we need to name what's happening so we can understand what we need to do and how we need to move in this. And so acknowledging that it's a systemic issue, we have a distinct responsibility in philanthropy to disrupt this system. And going back to Dr. Pearson's conceptual framework, so where are we? Where are we situated to disrupt this system as philanthropy? Philanthropy is the result of white wealth, which has been created from the labor of enslaved Africans and stolen indigenous land. And we're situated in this position where we control resources. And we set these resources up in philanthropy for others to access. But there are emotional, psychological, and physical hoops for folks to access these resources that we hold. And we can do this differently. And so that's what our time today is about. And that's what our time at the forum is going to be about. And that's really what we hope collectively in SAFSF is to understand, how do we do it differently? So how do we think about redefining what it means to be a steward of funds? How do we think about redefining expertise? How do we, as philanthropy, seek to earn trust and earn trust through humility and authentic relationship? And how do we also collectively recognize that resources aren't just money? All of us, every single one of us within SAFSF has power and influence that we can leverage in support of, and not on behalf of, leaders and organizations by and for people of color. But how have we typically responded? So we've done a lot of research at the World Food Policy Center, specifically around whiteness in food systems. And this is a quote from Rachel Slocum, who is a preeminent researcher on whiteness in food system. And I use this quote often because it talks so much about how whiteness permeates the food system. So thinking about things like these white ideals of health and nutrition, and these whitened dreams of farming and gardening. And what these whitened dreams of farming and gardening do is they erase both the past and the present of race and agriculture. What also happens is funding is mobilized to predominantly white organizations on behalf of non-white beneficiaries. So to do something on behalf of Black and Brown communities. And then also whiteness creates these inviting spaces for white people. And I want to think, use our own examples. So how are we interrogating ourselves, and just thinking about our forum that's coming up. So we are on a journey. We're all on this journey as individuals, as organizations individually, but also collectively as SAFSF. And we have invited community partners into the forum space. And for those of you who have been in previous forums when I was board chair, we always spoke to the fact that there are power dynamics in this space, but want to acknowledge that what the forum is, it is a whitened space. It's a power space, and it's exacerbated by this funder and partner dynamic. And so we've got this start, but we have not yet built this collective space. And we have a space where folks still have to be on their guard. So I want us to just be thinking about this as we're moving through. And saying that, I want to turn it over to Cameron to just talk a little bit about how you might see ways in which philanthropy, like what do we do in philanthropy that keeps us from operationalizing equity?
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for offering the opportunity for me to be here and share today. So what I can only do is share experiences as a woman who is a descendant of formerly enslaved African people, and my experience in doing the work alongside of and collaboration with Indigenous women and immigrant women. And so I think the biggest thing to operationalizing is people. So Jen knows that I say this over and over again. The work of equity or building liberative systems and structures. And I am fearful that my Wi-Fi.
Why don't you go off camera, Cam? Hey, Cam, we still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to switch over to my phone right after this slide. Give me a moment. Part of the issues is operationalizing equity is oftentimes, and like I said, for a lot of folks doing the work, this is more about our own individual work than it is about anything else, and how we actually view ourselves in terms of privilege, access, and resources, and then how we actually transfer that knowledge, that wisdom, or actually learn, having a reciprocal process from people who've been directly impacted, as their situations are very different than those who've actually had access and resources. So oftentimes when we're talking about operationalizing equity, it's through the lens of transference of power. We can't talk about equity without talking about power. And we can't talk about power without looking within a historical perspective. We have to look at it, as Dr. J has so eloquently exhibited here, and as Rachel Slocum and Marietta Ramirez and their works have exhibited. We have to look at the historical perspective of where actually power was actually developed, built, and sustained through, and actually the opposite of that is who it was extracted from, where were the intentional divestments made, and who benefited and who didn't. And oftentimes that's why I said it's more about the individual work, because that's a lot of hard work for us to do individually, to sit and listen and to learn things that were intentionally erased or hidden. Oftentimes we talk about who's been oppressed, but the erasure comes in, and that, in my opinion, is intention of actually, and it's intentional, not seeing who actually has benefited, instead of just focusing purely on who's been oppressed over and over and over again. And so looking at whiteness centering itself always, oftentimes will comport or center itself in positions of power and comfort and resources and access. And when we're trying to have these conversations, oftentimes when we're really getting to true equity, specifically equity that's rooted in liberation, it can start to feel very uncomfortable, for people who are accustomed to having everything centering them and what they want and what they need, and what's in their best self-interest. And so when we're talking about these systems, there is a conflict of interest, especially in people who've gained a huge amount of wealth. I always say over and over again, when people come to our community or come to our organization and they want to tell us how to do things, and especially if they're coming from a history of white wealth, what white wealth knows how to do is recreate white wealth. That's what white wealth knows how to do. I'm so sorry, my fur baby is freaking out. And so I often say there is a conflict of interest, because whether it's intentional or not intentional, people formulate strategies and ways of thinking and operationalization out of their own lived experience. And we have never had, at one point in time in this country, more or less I'll say in the Western Hemisphere, where we have had a system that has actually benefited everyone. We never have had that. And so how in the world, this is just from my perspective, how in the world are people who directly benefited disproportionately in such a huge way from the system that is divested from Black and brown people going to be able to create a system that actually benefits everyone? You need everyone, especially the people who have been directly impacted, especially those who've been intentionally divested from, in that conversation and leading the way to the equity and liberation in their own communities, because they actually know what they need. They know what's best for their communities to actually be the way that they should be in the first place.
Thanks, Cam. And as you're transitioning to your phone, I'll just touch on some research to your point about how whiteness shows up in terms of control, and how whiteness shows up in terms of who is making decisions for whom and how power is held. We did some research at the World Food Policy Center about how whiteness shows up in our work. And this analysis was based both in literature and with interviews with food justice leaders across the US. And what we fall into are these aspects of white supremacy culture, so individualism, paternalism, and neoliberalism, coming out in things that we support in philanthropy, ideas that we have, and ideals that we have. Things like, and I won't go through all of them, but things like, if they only knew, right? Like, how do we bring in education? Things like vote with your fork so that your consumption signals your values. Failure to listen, and Cameron and I are going to talk about this a little bit more, which essentially denies solutions from those directly impacted by the issues that we claim we're trying to address. The build it and they'll come happens over and over again. And this goes back to that concept of whitened spaces. It first assumes community needs and desires, and then creates white spaces to meet those assumed needs and desires. And we, just for the sake of time, won't go through all of these, but I'm glad to send out our white narratives research brief and have conversations with folks afterwards. But basically all of these narratives have common elements in that they pathologize people. They don't speak to the systems that Dr. Pearson was presenting about. What they do is they center power, they center ownership, and they center decision-making in predominantly white organizations. And then with that, they operationalize assumptions. And then they also work within this system of privilege to constantly reward itself. So asking things like not only who's getting to make these decisions for whom, but also who gets to fail, and then who gets time and space to learn from failures, and then gets investment again. So what do we need to do differently, and how does this show up? Cameron, I wondered if you could just spend a little bit of time, if you're back in, speaking to some of these aspects of these power imbalances, and how that's really played out in your experience navigating philanthropy. And particularly, maybe if you could, I think you're just logging back in, but maybe Cameron, if you could speak a little bit to how charity is an incomplete response to the issues that we're seeking to address.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Sorry, I had to switch over to the audio. I got a little confused with what mute button I was supposed to push. Yeah, so those Jen and Dr. J, others have heard me say this over and over again. It's like a broken record, that charity is an incomplete response to justice. And also have heard me say that charity is basically killing Black and brown people. What we need is basically systems and the creation and resources to help us recreate and to actually scale up systems that we once had during Jim Crow and even during Reconstruction within the Black community that are no longer viable for us because we don't have them anymore because of redlining and other national policies that have been instituted by our local and federal government. Paternalism only gets us so far. It also makes an assumption that the people that are actually participating in the paternalism in terms of who they're doing work for or on behalf of makes an assumption that people who have been directly impacted by institutional systemic racism do not have the wherewithal or the resources in terms of the abilities to be able to bring about the actual change that is needed. As Jenna said earlier, we are at a crossroads in this nation where we have wasted basically at this point probably almost trillions of dollars. I definitely think billions of dollars we have wasted, and we have actual outcomes that are reflective of, I don't know if many of you have seen Dr. Henry McCoy's report, if you were at the Rooted in Relationships conference that we had last week, that we are at the overall cumulative wealth in most mid-sized major metropolitan cities within the Black community, as we were at the time of the emancipation of slavery in terms of the overall cumulative wealth that Black people own. The reason being is because we own nothing. Everything has been divested from us. And so it's also based on a system of meritocracy, but meritocracy is actually based upon a narrative of people actually lifting themselves up by the bootstraps when we actually have we made the straps. Black and Indigenous people made all of those things in terms of if you look at the history, but we didn't actually receive any boots. We didn't receive any straps. And I will elaborate on how philanthropy is killing Black and brown people because it feeds into charity-based models. And for you to have to need charity as a Black and brown person, you have to go through some violent, traumatic event. You don't need charity when you're able to feed yourself. You don't need charity when you're able to have a house. You don't need charity when you have not been negatively traumatized and impacted by the criminal justice system. You need charity when you go through a life-changing, altering, traumatic event. And if you heard Dr. J earlier, the telomeres and the degenerative process that places on people with the cortisol and the health outcomes that we are having, on top of that, with the lack of healthy food, with the lack of safe, clean, affordable, dignified housing, with the lack of actually support, and also huge issues with racialized biases that are impacting Black and brown children in public school systems today. I hadn't even begun to talk about, the medical apartheid that we're actually experiencing, and also in terms of the negatively disproportionate police contact that some communities are experiencing. Very few philanthropic initiatives actually fund restorative practices and reparative funding mechanisms for communities to build power. We are addicted to charity in this nation. Charity gives people what they need for a moment. The largest scope of our work in CIP is food work, and I know a lot of people have heard this over and over again. And we don't ask the question, how do we feed people? And we don't seek to solve that. We do that to a certain extent. Our biggest load of what we're actually putting a huge amount of resources and thinking into is why are people hungry in the first place? Because for you to be hungry, that's a traumatic situation. And if you're hungry as an adult, you've got 3 children sitting there looking at you, and you've got multiple generations living in your house and nobody has food, and you go through that over and over and over again, and that's just food. That's not talking about how people are going without electricity in their house because of the regressive prices, the high rate electric costs for people now. That's not talking about the lack of infrastructure that people have because slumlords own the houses and they will not upfit the electricity. That's also not talking about the medical remediation that we have to do because in 2022, and I know in our community in Northeast Central Durham, North Carolina, we still have children testing positive for lead poisoning. Now, can you imagine all of this happening in your home at once? That's why philanthropy is killing Black and brown people, because we do very little to actually remediate those systems that bring that about. We want to just give people a little bit of food. We want to have porch programs. We want to have programs that help repairs and things of that nature. But what about the upkeep to keep those houses? We don't want to do anything in terms of the actual income and the economics that actually put people at a disadvantage so they don't qualify for banking. We don't want to do anything to actually bring awareness to the redlining that's currently going on in our banking systems, because the banking system has actually just redefined itself and readapted. We still have redlining going on in 2022. And so how do we talk about these types of things so that we actually are moving towards outcomes that we say we want to have, versus actually regressing in a lot of ways in terms of our outcomes, not only in just wealth, but also the health of Black and brown communities.
So Cameron, we're gonna jump to the how, right? Because the outcomes, Dr. Pearson has presented them. These are kind of where we are in East Durham, where CIP is located. And then, if we just look at the last 20 years of rates of food insecurity, by percentage, we are at the same place that we were 20 years ago. So as Cameron said, focusing our efforts, and I know food insecurity is not the only thing that we work on within SAFSF, but it is a good broad measure of the work. And clearly the outcome of like what we're doing is not working. So how might we do it differently? What does justice look like? So Cameron said, justice is power transfer. And this means directly addressing and correcting power imbalances. But one thing that I'd like to note is that this is something for us to really key into here in philanthropy, because you can't transfer power if you don't have power. So I've seen so many instances of folks looking to, community leaders, Black and brown communities, and say, fix this power differential. And, it's like asking somebody for a cookie if you have a cookie and they don't have a cookie. So we need to talk about what this looks like, this shift from paternalism to empowerment, meritocracy to context and relationship, and control to trust. And Cameron, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about things like expertise and community-rooted leadership.
Sorry, I had to unmute my phone. Oftentimes, when people are looking for experts or subject matter experts, they often go into spaces, academic institutions like Duke, like UNC, of which we have awesome partnerships. But they also go, they're also community organizations like ourselves who've had some not so great interactions. And so when they look for these people that are considered subject matter experts, they often go to people who oftentimes disproportionately so are not directly impacted themselves, like Dr. J, like Dr. Danielle on our team, or Dr. Nishani on our team. They go to actually people who've been studying this as a case of study in terms of how in their academic career, but have not been directly impacted. There's something that it really illuminates how to really get at the crux of the problem, the closer you are to the impact. And so one of the things I do want to share is how it looks like power over versus power with. And so we had a situation in CIP where in our community-rooted framework that we actually wrote a peer-reviewed publication. Myself, Aliyah Abdul-Rahman, who is co-founder of CIP, along with Dr. Danielle Spurlock and Dr. Kay Jowers from UNC and Duke, respectively, had a powerful think tank actually co-opt a nice chunk of our work, and was able, because we have such a strong relationship with Stacy, Anna, and Chantel at Kresge, a pretty powerful philanthropic organization in and of its own right. And they were able to actually use their power to broker a meeting for us to actually talk and share, because the analysis that came forward in our paper that we had actually written, our community is very deep and very beautiful, but it's also that analysis came with a very deep cost. We lost a lot of people way too young. We've buried elders when we didn't have to. We've lost dads who killed themselves, all sorts of things because they could not supply for their family. We've lost young men at the prime of their life because of gang violence. We live in the context in the community in which we serve. I don't have the luxury, quote unquote, I don't view it as a luxury, but other people probably would, to be able to ride in and ride out Monday through Friday and then be in a suburban neighborhood. I live in the context in the community. I am with my people. So we have paid a very high price for the analysis that we have earned, and the same is for Aaliyah. So when Kresge brokered that conversation with us, we were able to communicate that very clearly, very truthfully, and listen to the think tank. And they were actually able to understand the harm that they were doing, because when a major think tank comes and co-ops language and ideology and actually changes it to formulate a framework that actually is the same old, who is going to listen to our framework as a small, community-rooted, majority Black and woman-led organization? And so by the time that whole session, that whole multiple conversations and meetings were over, the think tank retracted our language, actually cited us correctly in the paper, and actually wanted to connect with us to actually co-facilitate a blog. And so it was very honoring for Stacy and her team, Anna and Chantel, to really highlight and protect a small little organization like we represent. And that was power. Kresge had power over, but then they shifted it to being power with. And from that, it's led us to a conversation of how do we have think tanks that are rooted, controlled, created in the framework and identity of people who've been directly impacted, and not just people who are distant away from the impact.
Cameron, thanks so much for sharing that specific example, and a specific example from our SAFSF membership, because experiencing that with you, seeing this power shift from a power mechanism to a justice mechanism, where it really was this power with, it was the standing with, it was this saying yes and this understanding, and taking action to earn the trust of communities in partnership, not just assuming that communities in partnership was going to trust Kresge or anyone else in this space because they'd already had the experience of their work being co-opted. So I just wanted to kind of highlight a few of those points, because I think, it's so easy for us in philanthropy to really study and get really keyed in on terms and ideas, but then operationalizing the how of how we do things is what's so important. And I'm going to skip to our recommendations, because I do think this is something that's so important, large scale. And we put this recommendation forward. So Cameron presented to the National Academies of Medicine. And as I mentioned previously, Cameron's part of the National Equitable Food Oriented Development Executive Steering Committee. And so these recommendations are centering EFOD, but EFOD is one of many power transfer mechanisms that exist. And Cameron, I don't know if you want to talk specifically to this. I can also do that as a follow-up to you.
There's not a whole lot I can add other than I think Jen has said it so well that, equitable food-oriented development from our perspective is a mechanism to actually build a wealth building strategy across all of the social determinants of health. And as Jen so states over and over again, and then there's determinants of the social determinants of health that we have to work on as well. And so viewing food as a tool or a mechanism, as an entree into us having these conversations to build strategies that aren't predicated on charity, that are really centering the wealth building. We're not saying that we can't feed, that we shouldn't feed people. We're not saying that at all. What we're saying is the only focus right now is only feeding people. And at some point we have to pivot, because we'll be feeding people. And while we're feeding people, there's going to be greater and greater numbers of those people while we're feeding them, because that's not what they need to actually sustain healthy, thriving lives. We're losing more and more people over and over and over again. And that's negatively impacting entire families. It's negatively impacting the future generations. It is a huge toll. and the cost in and of itself of just being so focused on charity is massive in terms of the numbers and the human toll that it has taken on us as a nation. And what we're stating is creating avenues and systems and levels of accountability and trusting the people that have been directly impacted and intentionally divested from historically in this nation with the tools, the resources, the relationships, the networks, the things that they need to rebuild our communities again. I'm in spaces with a lot of Indigenous women, with a lot of Black women, with some immigrant women, and I tell you, I love the men in my community, but women, when you especially empower women, the overall outcome and output, what my team has been able to actually do with very little is astounding. When you sow into communities, especially led by women, because we not only want to take care of our own households with the children that we bore and that we love and our partners and whatnot, we also want everyone else in our communities to thrive. Because we care, we mother, and we care. We want our children's friends to be well. We want our children's parents and grandparents to be well. We want everyone to thrive. And that's what this work is about. It's about rebuilding communities once again so that they can call their own shots, have their own ways. It doesn't mean people aren't going to mess up, but I'm going to go back to what Jen says. We've been messing up pretty badly because what we're doing is not working, because we can see the data. It's very clear telling us that we're not working. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jen. If we have any questions or any comments from anyone?
I think we'll just maybe wrap on a question from Kat, who would just love to hear any thoughts or recommendations also on those reparative funding and relationship approaches. So, Cameron, you gave a great example of the work with Kresge. Just wondering if there were other relationships or other shifts that you're seeing that you really feel like are moving towards this justice-based framework.
Yeah, I think a lot of funders are trying to see ways in which they can actually push the needle and help us, especially smaller scale organizations with things such as, for small organizations that have small budgets or have track records that aren't in excess of $1 million, how we can actually legally and competently get over this tipping and some of this other stuff that's been set up to actually keep organizations, slow down the progress we're able to make. We're at such a critical scale right now that we don't have but so much time. We really do not, especially with climate change and the environmental justice issues looming specifically for Black and Brown people. We have to move at a pretty quick pace to actually get some of these things remediated. And those types of partnerships where we've worked with like some of the folks at Duke. We've had wonderful examples of Robert Wood Johnson. I'm a culture of health leader, of course, and so is Aaliyah. And that's stabilized a lot of our relationships with Robert Wood Johnson and Kresge have had a lot of, we've had a really good track record with them transferring and helping us build the capacity as a Black and woman-led organization to actually be able to get the funding, because the work that we need to do is going to take a lot of money and a lot of resources, to be honest with you. And that's not just for us, that's for all Black, Indigenous, POC-led organizations, specifically ones that are rooted and accountable, led by not just someone that runs the organization that's Black or Indigenous or BIPOC. I'm talking about that's been created by, that's been accountable to, rooted in their community and context, and the community recognizes them as a leader.
Great. Thank you so much, Cameron. And thank you so much, Dr. Pearson, for all of these, all of the data, all of the information, and all of the examples. Erin, I know we're at time, so I wanted to turn it back over to you to wrap us.
Thanks, Jen. And again, thank you, Cameron and Jay, for sharing your personal experiences, your data, your research. There's clearly a lot of time and thought that went into all of your remarks, as well as you, Jen. Thank you for putting it to us so honestly. It's the kind of conversation that we need to continue to have in these philanthropic spaces. So I'll just do a quick final plug for SAFSF's 20th Annual Forum that's going to be this June 20th through the 22nd in Kansas City, Missouri. This webinar is just the tiniest little tip of the iceberg of the kinds of conversations that we hope to have, hosted by you all, members and funders in our network, in collaboration with community partners. So I really hope that you all will join us there in Kansas City. I'm gonna plug the, if I can multitask, plug the forum website once more. Check out the program, check out the content, check out our really robust speaker directory, and definitely register or reach out to myself, Susie, anyone on the SAFSF staff, any of our board members for questions about what you might be able to expect. And again, the biggest round of applause for all three of you for sharing your time today. Thank you.